In the criminal justice system, the people are represented by two separate yet equally important groups: the police who investigate crime and the district attorneys who prosecute the offenders. These are their stories.
Hey, who voted in our Instagram poll about our next series? That was you? Did you vote Hero to Zero? Good job, you got it right. Who voted for something that wasn't Hero to Zero? You got it wrong, James, I'm sorry. I love you a lot. So in Hero to Zero, you may have noticed there are some notable kings that were on the screen there. In Hero to Zero, we are looking at kings who went from hero to zero. Do you guys like that audio? It's funny. It's funny. And even though it might seem a little far off, it might seem a little odd to look at these stories, there's some wisdom to be gleaned. I know we said it like 800 times, but I'm really excited for tonight. I'm really glad that it's one night. I'm really glad that each and every single one of you are here, because I believe that there's something cool here tonight. So the very first king, anybody know his name? Slytherin. Nope, it was King Saul. King Saul. But before, we need a little of this and a little of this, because how do we even get kings? Nathan, I see that you're wearing the camp shirt from this past year. The past summer camp, we looked at the story of Israel leaving Egypt. Very early on in the Bible, Israel was enslaved to Egypt. Pharaoh was, you guys seen The Prince of Egypt? Yeah. Really good movie, you should watch it. Very early on in the Bible, Israel is enslaved to Egypt. Moses says, let my people go. Pharaoh says no. He says that 10 times. They finally let him go. They crossed the Red Sea. They're wandering in the desert for 40 years. You guys know the story. After 40 years, they finally arrive to the promised land. And Moses dies. Joshua is the new guy in town. He sends in spies. They see Jericho. They say, oh, that's really scary. Long story short, they start taking the promised land. They start clearing out the inhabitants. God is using Israel to judge those people for their sins. And now the nation of Israel lives there. Awesome. But Israel did not do exactly what God told them to do. God said, hey, go clear this much land. They said, we'll clear most of it, but not all of it. And this caused a lot of problems for them. More on that in a second. I am finishing my master's degree right now because I'm a big nerd. Don't clap. Don't clap. It's actually fun, and I enjoy it a lot. I really enjoy writing, and I'll send you some papers if you want to read some of them. But it's really, really fun. And every single major assignment that I turn in, I have Bree look over it. But before I even have Bree look over my work, I have Bree read the instructions for the assignment, and then she reads what I did. Because I also have a friend who is attending Liberty University right now. That's where I'm going, online, believe it or not. I don't drive up there. My friend is there. And every single time I call and check in, I'm like, hey, you slacking or are you doing great? He says, I'm doing great. And I say, that's great. And he was kind of going over some assignments with me. He wanted some help on one specific one. So I said, okay, send me what you have right now. And he's like, I don't have anything because I'm a little stuck. I don't understand how to get started. I don't really know what I'm supposed to do. And I said, did you read the instructions? And he said, no. If you're ever uncertain of what to do in life and there's instructions, you might be a little dumb. Read the instructions. So you read the instructions, and guess what the instructions tell you? They tell you what to do. So if you just do what the instructions tell you to do, even if your work is garbage, you'll probably get an okay grade. You'll probably get an okay grade. And it doesn't matter if you're the best writer, if you go off on tangents, whatever. If you don't do what the instructions tell you to do, you probably won't get a good grade. That's a very, very common theme here with this series, Hero to Zero. Because I guarantee you there's going to be spots in your life where you might feel like a hero, and if you don't follow the instructions, if you do not do what is asked of you, if you do not do what you're told to do, you might find yourself a zero. And that has never been more true of any king than King Saul. So, remember Israel. They're in the promised land. They're doing great. God gives, you guys remember this way back from How Not to Read the Bible. God gave his people laws and rules to differentiate them from the surrounding nations and or to protect them, right? One of the laws, it wasn't necessarily explicitly stated, God told his people, you aren't supposed to have a king. You are not supposed to have a king. However, if you read the book of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, then you have Joshua. That's when they start going and clearing out the promised land. Now they have their own land, they're their own country. And then you have the book of Judges. And in the book of Judges, the most commonly repeated phrase is everyone did what was right in their own eye. I don't know about you guys, but a lot of the stuff that we like to do as a society, as a world, is not always right. But in those days, everyone did what was right in their own eyes. So Israel does not have a king. How are they functioning? How are they being led? They're being led by these judges. Oftentimes, judges function somewhat as a king. Oftentimes, judges are priests and prophets. But Israel is being led. They just don't have a person to say, oh, there's our king. Make sense? But Israel is a little bit stiff-necked, to use a biblical term. They whine, they complain, and they don't follow the instructions. And they just keep griping and complaining. And they say, we want a king, God. This is very telling of humanity. I don't know if you guys know this. You really, 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 really want to be led. More than that, you really, really, really want to follow something or someone. I don't know if you've ever thought about that about yourself, but we as human beings desire to be led. We desire to have a person to look up to lead us, that we look to for guidance. That's just who we are. It's how God made us, because he is supposed to lead us, right? But in the book of Judges, everybody was doing what they wanted, and it did not turn out well. We want a king. Okay, God hears you. And God says, you know what? I'm going to give you a king. There was a tall, say tall, strong, handsome. I'm not talking about me. There was a tall, strong, handsome guy, a Jewish guy from the tribe of Benjamin. He had it going on. He's a great guy. And he looked really legit. And God said, you know what? There's your king, Israel. You want a king so bad you can have him. Guess what his name was? His name was Saul. You guys are way ahead of me. But guess what? From the get-go, Saul was not a very good king. From the get-go, Saul was not a very good king. He was tall, he was strong, he was handsome. He looked like he should have been a king. But he was really scared and he was really insecure. And we're going to see those two things come up a lot tonight. Before Saul became the king, there was a guy by the name of Samuel. You can read about him in the book of Samuel. There's two of them, 1st and 2nd Samuel. Samuel was the judge of Israel before Saul became the king. And then Saul did become the king, and Samuel was the prophet. Samuel did what God told him to do. He was the pastor. He was the spiritual leader of Israel. He offered sacrifices. He talked to people about God. He led the people spiritually. He led them in every way, except now there's a new guy named Saul. And if there's one thing that we can learn about Saul before he ever even does anything, it's this. Just because someone looks the part does not mean that they're legit. Just because someone looks the part does not mean they're legit. I had a friend that I met in college. His name was Aaron. He was about 6'7", probably had about a 7-foot wingspan. He was a freshman. I was a freshman. We had an ice cream social for all the freshmen. There was a football being tossed around. One of my best friends who I met at that is now a youth pastor up in Lake Norman. We were throwing the football, and here comes Aaron. He was on my hall. He looks like a beast. We were like, yo, Aaron. And I kid you not, I literally kid you not. He saw the ball coming and went, and it hit him straight in the face. And I immediately was like, wouldn't have expected that from that guy. Because that guy looks like he could go to the NFL right now. And just because someone looks like they should be followed does not mean that they should be followed. Just because someone looks strong or mighty or brave doesn't mean that they are those things. And God said, you guys want a king so bad, here's your guy. And everybody was stoked about this new king. Because he was tall, he was strong, and he was handsome. Turned out not to be a great king. What do kings do? They fight battles. Remember, Israel is supposed to be clearing out the promised land. They are ridding the land of the wicked people. And Saul leads them in battle, and Saul wins a battle. And this is where our story picks up in 1 Samuel chapter 13, starting in verse 8. Saul just won a huge battle. He's spoken to Samuel. They were texting each other. They were Snapchatting. They weren't doing that. But Samuel told Saul, hey, if you win this battle, I will be there in a few days and we can offer sacrifices to thank God. They won the big battle. They're waiting. He, being Saul, waited 7 days, the time appointed by Samuel. But Samuel did not come up to Gilgal, and the people were scattering from him. So Saul said, bring the burnt offering here to me and the peace offerings. And Saul offered the burnt offering. As soon as he had finished offering the burnt offering, behold, Samuel arrived. And Saul went out to meet him and greet him. Samuel said, "What have you done?" And Saul said, "When I saw that the people were scattering from me, and that you did not come within the appointed time, and that the Philistines had mustered at Michmash, I said, now the Philistines are going to come down against me at Gilgal, and I have not sought the favor of the Lord. So I forced myself, and I offered the burnt offering." And Samuel said to Saul, "You have done foolishly. You have not kept the command of the Lord your God, which he commanded you. For then the Lord would have established your kingdom over Israel forever. But now your kingdom shall not continue. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart, and the Lord has commanded him to be the prince over his people, because you have not kept what the Lord commanded you." And Samuel arose and went up from Gilgal. The rest of the people went up after Saul to meet the army. Then they went up from Gilgal to Gibeah of Benjamin. Remember how I said Saul was the king? He was now the leader of the people. But just because Saul was now the king does not mean that there were not priests and prophets. Samuel was one of those. Sacrificing to the Lord was a very big deal. A very big deal. And you know who was allowed to do it? Priests and prophets. You know who was explicitly told not to do it? Anybody who's not a priest or a prophet. And all of a sudden, Samuel doesn't necessarily seem to be coming, and Saul is like, I have to do this right now. And that was a big deal. Saul was scared. Saul's insecurity led him to live for people rather than God. Look at what verse 8 says. Saul waited 7 days, the time appointed by Samuel, but Samuel did not come to Gilgal, and the people were scattering from him. So, the people were scattering from him. So, Saul realized, Saul watched, Saul saw the people leaving him. They just won a huge battle, and then the Philistines were really mad that they lost the battle, so they had mustered 30,000 Philistines to come fight Israel. And Saul is watching. The allure, the euphoric victory of 7 days ago was starting to wear off. And Israel was starting to get a little disinterested, and they're like, Saul, that was a great battle, dude. I'm going to go home. I got to tend to my flock, miss my wife, see my kids. I'll see you later. And Saul was so insecure that he said, well, I can just do the burnt offering now. I can just do it right now. It's not a big deal. I can do it. Samuel knew, and Saul knew that only Samuel was allowed to sacrifice to the Lord. But because Saul was so insecure, because he was so focused on what the people thought of him, he said, I can just go ahead and do this now, and maybe the people will stick here by my side. This was a huge no-no, and he knew that. But he was more concerned with what the people who started to leave him thought of him than what God thought of him. And this was a very big deal. And immediately, one strike, you're out, Saul. This is how seriously God takes the leadership of his people. Samuel shows up and says, what have you done, Saul? Because of this, God has already removed you from being king. In God's mind, you're still in charge, I guess, but you are no longer the king. Saul was done because Saul was operating from a place of, what do the people think about me? As opposed to operating from a place of, is what I'm doing right now okay in God's eyes? And God did not take that lightly. So my question for us is, are there areas of your life that you take other people's opinions into account more than you take God's opinion into account? Another way to rephrase that is, are you following the instructions given to you by God, or are you acting as if you have to win the approval of everybody else? Saul was trying to do the second thing. Are you living your life for the approval, the opinions of other people, or are you living your life doing what God has asked you to do? Most often, those two things do not necessarily go hand in hand. I went to public school a long time ago, and I know that living for God is not the exact same way that everybody else on the scene lives. It's one of the saddest verses. Literally, Saul's anointed king, they go out to battle, they win, it's awesome. The Philistines don't like that they lost that battle, so they amass 30,000 soldiers. The people start to leave Saul. He starts to freak out, and he says, you know what, I'll just offer this offering. And Samuel says, you're not the king anymore. God has removed you from the throne. And here's what this looks like. Samuel actually left this place with Saul, and Samuel goes to meet a guy named Jesse. Jesse had a few sons. The youngest son of Jesse's was named David. And at this time, Samuel, who's following the instructions of the Lord, unlike dumb Saul, is following what God tells him to do. And Samuel, this is kind of confusing, Samuel anoints David king. That does not mean that David is the king because Saul is still alive. Does that make sense? Saul was not allowed to just be king and then, now he's not, he's just over there. Saul is king until he dies. But God has already chosen the next in line, and his name was David. So Samuel goes, he anoints David. David is now the next king of Israel. He's probably an 8th grade boy, weighs 100 pounds, and he's the next king of Israel. Not yet, but he knows he's going to be. So Samuel then leaves Jesse and Jesse's sons. And remember how there were 30,000 Philistines coming up to meet the Israelite army? 30,000 against 6,000? The Philistines are going to win. To make it worse, you guys seen Thor Ragnarok? Marvel's trash, by the way. But you guys seen Jeff Goldblum's character on that trash planet, and they've got this champion, big old green guy? That's Goliath. The Philistines have amassed 30,000 soldiers, and if that was not enough, they've got a huge giant that nobody can beat. Saul has sent a few warriors out to try and fight this ultimate Philistine champion, and Goliath waxes him. And all of a sudden, here comes a little shepherd boy who's bringing his brothers who are fighting in the battle. He's bringing them lunch. His name is David. You guys are listening. And David, we know the story. David says, who's going to step up against this punk? David kills him after Saul, who should have been fighting Goliath, allows a little tiny kid to go fight his battles because he's afraid and he's insecure. David beats Goliath. How do you think that made Saul feel? We don't have to wonder. Check this out. 1 Samuel chapter 18, starting in verse 9. This is actually hilarious. As they were coming home, when David returned from striking down the Philistine, the women came out of all the cities of Israel singing and dancing to meet King Saul with tambourines and songs of joy and with musical instruments. Let's pause right there. David killed Goliath, right? You guys saw that. David killed Goliath. Israel won the battle. And all of the women are coming out in the streets going, ooh, King Saul. But Saul's so insecure that he can't let David have any part of his victory. And the women sang to one another and celebrated, Saul has struck down his thousands. That's what it sounds like if you read the audio Bible. That wasn't even me, that was whatever. And the women sang to one another as they celebrated, Saul has struck down his thousands and David tens of thousands. And Saul was very angry, and this saying displeased him. He said, they have ascribed to David 10,000s, and to me they've ascribed thousands. And what more can he have but the kingdom? And Saul eyed David from that day on. Have you guys ever heard of Survivor? You guys know what Survivor is? So here's what Survivor is. 20 people get shipped into Fiji, and they live on a beach, and they're in little tribes of 6 or 7, and they just live, and they compete in challenges, and they have to build relationships, because if your tribe loses, one of you is going to get voted out by everybody else. So there's so much fear and insecurity in this game, and I don't want to sound like that old guy, but the new generation of these Survivor players are soft. And in this new season, there's a guy, this is so funny, there's a guy there who is, I feel bad laughing at him. He's so insecure. And he feels like everybody else in his tribe is connecting better than he is connecting with them. And literally there's a scene where he cuts open a coconut and he gets the coconut water and they eat the coconut. And then the other guy on the tribe cuts open a coconut and they cheer for that guy. And this guy's literally having a mental breakdown on national television. And he's explaining to Jeff, the host of the show, I cut open the coconut and they didn't cheer for me. And then he cut open the coconut and they cheered for him. And this dude is losing his mind because of how insecure he is. He cannot fathom anybody but him getting credit or applause or praise. And the exact same thing is true of King Saul here. We read the story and poo-poo on King Saul because of how insecure he is, somewhat rightfully so. But Saul is the leader of Israel. Saul won the battle. Saul and the Israelite army come back to Jerusalem and they're like, oh, King Saul. And then they're like, David did a pretty good job too, but awesome, King Saul. But because there's focus and praise on anybody but King Saul, he is cripplingly insecure and he eyes David from that day forward. And seriously, you guys should read 1st and 2nd Samuel. It's crazy. Saul was not only insecure, Saul was scared. Saul's insecurity and fear led him to live for people rather than for God. The rest of Saul being the king of Israel, he was constantly looking at David. He was looking at what David was doing, and he was so jealous that Saul's jealousy led him to focus on himself and others more than he focused on God. Saul's jealousy led him to focus on himself and the little shepherd boy David more than he focused on God. And quite simply, once again, Saul could not follow the instructions for his life. From this moment on, every single thing that Saul did was through the lens of, well, what's David doing? Are the people going to like David more than me? Remember that Saul was tall and strong, and he's one of the few people that the Bible describes as handsome, which means he was probably a stud. And then there's literally probably 12, 13, 14-year-old David. And Saul is like, do they like him more than me? But because he is so jealous of David, his entire life was based on, are they gonna like me? Are they gonna approve of what I do? And he never once considered what God thought about who he was or what he was doing. And from the get-go, from his first mistake, God said, the kingdom's not yours anymore, bro. You're done. So the story goes on. And there's more battles. And eventually Samuel, who's God's prophet, who used to be the judge, Saul really leaned on Samuel. Instead of trying to connect with God himself, Saul was really leaning way too much on Samuel. And Samuel got old and he died. It's really sad. Really sad. And then one day, there's another battle brewing. And Saul is afraid, he's insecure, he's jealous of David, and he says, well, Samuel's gone, so what do I do? I don't even know what you guys know about Christianity, but you can probably pick up that this is wrong. Saul goes to what the Bible describes as a witch. It was literally a necromancer, someone who spoke to the dead. He was trying to speak to Samuel. I can tell you right now that God doesn't like that. If you ever played with a Ouija board, God doesn't like that. Dead things are dead. We are alive. God is alive. Don't try and talk to dead things. God didn't like it then. Saul goes to a witch and tries to speak to dead Samuel. This is how insecure he is. Rather than going to God, he was still trying to find approval from dead people. And obviously this is a very egregious sin. Once again, he's not following the instructions. So they go and they fight this battle. They're losing the battle because of Saul's insecurity and fear and horrible leadership. And at the end of the battle, Saul eventually kills himself. Because he cannot face the shame, he cannot face the dishonor, and he falls on his own sword and he dies. And I guarantee you, all the way back from the very first battle that Saul fought, if he just followed the instructions and if he just listened to God, that would not have happened. And this was the life of King Saul. Israel, here's your king. He's tall, he's strong, he's handsome. Can't want any more from a ruler. Except he's really afraid and he's really insecure and he for some reason refuses to actually talk to God. And he refuses to follow the instructions of what God has told him to do. And again, we read the story postscript where we can see Saul's whole life. Saul never really did anything out of horrible, evil intentions. Saul, in his mind, thought he was trying to do the right thing. But he was so afraid and he was so insecure that he never once consulted God. He lived his life for the approval of other people. Every single thing that Saul did was through the lens of, well, what are the people going to think? Are they going to like David more than me? How is this going to make me look as the king? And then he died. And there's lots more kings that we're going to read about. The next one is a guy named David. He's pretty cool, but he has his own share of failures too. So we got to do this, right? Because the question is, who cares about King Saul? Why are we reading about King Saul? How does this affect me? Why should we read this? Why is it in the Bible? And most importantly, where's the big dog? Where is Jesus in all of this? Well, my question for you is, if you read any of the Old Testament, even with a guy who's as sick as Moses, we've already looked at how David was a great ruler, but he wasn't perfect. Where is Jesus in all of this? I can see the strength of Jesus in Saul's shortcomings. I can see the hope of Jesus in Saul's fear. I can see the strength of Jesus in Saul's insecurity. And more than anything, whenever we follow something that is not meant to be followed, because remember, just because somebody looks the part does not mean that they're legit. There's one person who's ever been legit enough for you to actually follow. His name's Jesus. So as we read the story of King Saul tonight, and really the whole rest of the series, I'm just going to ask you, who is your king? Who is your king? Because maybe you've never considered it, maybe you've never thought about it. You are following someone. You are following someone. And maybe you can't necessarily identify with the battle itineraries and everything that King Saul did as a king, but are you living your life trying to follow Jesus and trying to do the right thing, but are you living your life trying to live for other people's approval? Are you doing things based on what other people are going to see or think or feel about you? Or are you trying to follow what God is saying? Because Saul lived his life living for other people. His king was not God. He himself was his king, and look where that led him. Who is your king? Who are you following? What are you following? Because I know that a good portion of us would say, well, Jesus is my king, and that's fantastic. But look at what you do, and look at what you say, and look at how you act. And I'm not coming down on it, but what do you live for? Who are you seeking the approval of? Why do you do or dress or speak or laugh at the things that you do? And I think it's a perfect self-reflection question, because if we are saying, yeah, we follow God, yeah, I'm cool with God, yeah, I'm an Israelite just like King Saul is, but I'm really just trying to do my own thing. And I'm not necessarily following God's instructions. Because that was Saul, and he was a pretty horrible king. And I am a pretty horrible king. And you guys are pretty bad kings and queens. So I know it's one night, and we always tell you guys, yes, bring your friends, because the most important thing that could ever happen is someone making the decision to live life with Jesus as their king. So it's somewhat of a rhetorical question, but I'm here to ask you tonight, do you need Jesus to be your king? Are you tired of following yourself? Are you tired of following what you think everybody else thinks is cool? Are you tired of trying to fit in? Are you tired of trying to win the approval of your parents? Are you tired of trying? Because in Jesus' kingdom, we're not citizens by what we do. We're citizens because he is our king, and that's enough. And there's so much pain, and there's so much strife, and there's so much fear, and there's so much insecurity, and I'm telling you, the only way where we can live a life not dominated by those things is if Jesus is our king. Because if Jesus is not our king, you probably will live a life dominated by fear and insecurity and self-image and how good you are and how good you can be. But if Jesus is your king, that's it. You can just be. Come to Jesus. Just like we talked about last week, Jesus is looking at us and he's saying, follow me. Let Jesus be your king. I know that's kind of weird. It might sound kind of funky, but if we can come to Jesus and say, Jesus, you are the king of my life. You don't have to fight to be good enough. You don't have to live, do they like David better than me? You don't have to do anything other than come to Jesus and say, King Jesus, what do you ask of me? Because nobody's ever asked that question and received no answers. One of my favorite verses in the entire Bible is Jesus himself speaking, and he says, all who come to me, I will never cast out. All who come to me, I will never cast out. So if you've been living as your own king, as your own queen, if you've been following other people, if you've been following your parents, if you've been following anything other than Jesus, I'm here to tell you tonight, the good news is that you can rest and that you can give up and that you can stop trying to be anything other than who God made you to be, and that is a person who lives with him as your king. He's the only one good enough to be king. I'm not, your parents aren't, your friends aren't, what you see on social media is not. Only Jesus is good enough to be your king. I want you guys to just close your eyes and hear these last verses here. There's a guy in the New Testament, about 1,000, maybe 1,100 years later, and his name is also Saul. And this Saul is also a strong Jewish guy. He's actually a Pharisee, and he really thinks that he lives with God as his king. And he's trying to do right. He's trying to live a perfect life. He's trying to do good enough and be good enough and uphold the law and do what he thinks is right. And it's exhausting and he can't do it anymore. And he's traveling from one place to another and he meets a guy named Jesus. And Jesus looks at him and says, hey, you're not Saul anymore. Your new name is Paul. And Paul transformed early Christianity and took it all over the world. And he was beaten for his faith, and he was persecuted, and ultimately he was killed. But I can promise you that he lived a life full of rest because he knew who his king was. And his angriest letter to one of the churches that he helped start was a church in Galatia. And these false teachers, these people who were teaching things that were blatantly wrong and harmful, they came into the church in Galatia and said, hey, it's cool that you guys want to follow Christ, but you also have to follow the law, and you have to do this, and you have to be this. And they started adding things on top of what it meant to follow Jesus. And Paul did not like that, and he writes them a letter, and in the very first chapter, he says this, for am I now seeking the approval of man or of God? Or am I trying to please man? If I were still trying to please people, I would no longer be a servant of Christ. Friends, the good news of the gospel is that if Jesus is your king, you don't have to win, you don't have to be good enough, you don't have to do anything other than come to Jesus and say, King Jesus, here I am. I love you guys more than you could ever know. All of the leaders in this room love you more than you could ever know. And more than anything, Jesus loves you more than you could ever know. And I think that Jesus sees your pain and he sees your hurt and he sees your striving and he sees your shortcomings and he says, please stop trying to be your own king. Please stop trying to be your own queen. Jesus knows our fears, he knows our doubts, he knows our suffering, and he knows our insecurities. And he still chose to go to the cross and die the death that we deserve so that he could give us the life that he deserves. We're about to sing a song, and I love this song because it says, oh, come to the altar. And an altar is not a thing that we really talk about in church. Lots of churches don't have a literal altar anymore. But an altar is where Saul made the wrongful sacrifice to God. An altar is a place where you offer things up to God. And in the entire Bible, that was a place where you took things to kill them. And I know that a lot of us live lives dominated not by King Jesus, but by fear and doubt and shame and anxiety and insecurity. So for this next song, you can stand up if you want to, but I don't want you to stand up because your neighbor stands up. You can come to the crosses if you want to, but I don't want you to go to the crosses because anybody else is. I want you to close your eyes, think about these words, and ask King Jesus what is in the way of you following him. What things are in your heart that you need to let die. What fear, what insecurity, what shame is preventing you from following Jesus to the fullest extent. Friends, I know that this is just a Wednesday. I know that we've got school today, we got school tomorrow, the world is in chaos. Tonight, do not leave this place the same way that you came. Because I can only imagine how Jesus feels having died for us, watching us live a life, trying to carry and pay for the things that he is so willing and ready to take from us. If you have some things in your heart and in your mind that you don't want to leave this place with, let them die. Come to King Jesus. Jesus, we love you. God, we thank you for tonight. Just be with us. Help us to hear these words. Help us to sing these words. Help us to see you. Help us to know you. We love you, Jesus. Amen.